Time we were together, we were talking about the things we're in chapter 6.
Do you want that one?
Yeah, this will probably work better.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize you even used the wireless.
Excuse me a minute.
Sorry about that.
This way, if I start to roam, which I typically do, you can still hear me. And see what happens when Joe's on vacation or gone or for whatever reason. We're just lost without him. As I was saying, we're in chapter 6 of the book of Matthew. We're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And we've been talking about the Sermon on the Mount on the premise that if we're going to be people of Christ, if we're going to be Christians, if we're going to be people who wear His name, it's important for us to know what He taught. And it's important for us to understand the kind of people He wants us to be. Last time we were together, we talked about the first parts of chapter 6. And there are a couple of things in that passage. There are actually three things. We're going to get to the third one today. The first one was talking about giving, and well, it's more or less, it could be two things, I suppose. Now I sound like Monty Python. The first two things are three things. Talked about the manner of dress. You know, don't wear your phylacteries large or your tassels big just to be seen of people. The second one was when you give, don't bang the tambourines and drums for people to see what you're giving and to make a big deal of what you're giving. And then the third one was prayer, or don't pray in order to be seen of people. And then he taught them, he gave them a sample prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer. These things, can you remember, what was Jesus talking about at the very end of chapter 5? What was the very end of chapter 5? What was his concluding comment at the end of chapter 5? He said, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," but why? In what way did he want his listeners, his audience there, to be perfect as God is perfect? He said specifically, what did he say about the righteousness that he wanted from his people? Look at the end of chapter 5. He wanted to be perfect, but he said something specifically. Your righteousness must be what? It must be greater than the righteousness of the Pharisees. Okay? I think that these three things that we've been talking about, or four things, they're talking about manner of dress, giving, prayer, and then we're going to talk about fasting here in a minute. I think those things relate to that. He's showing them how the righteousness of the Pharisees is not the kind of righteousness that God wants. Okay? So let's move on. Let's talk about fasting. This is in verse 16 of chapter 6. He says, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." That's a comment that he's made several times. If you're doing this to be seen of people, and you're seen of people, okay, you got what you wanted, that's your reward. "But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Okay. He is saying, he's not saying, okay, let me ask it this way, and maybe we should go on to the next slide. We're talking about what does this mean? And as I said, keep in mind, this is part of greater righteousness comment in chapter 5. Your righteousness must be greater than that of the Pharisees. And I think by corollary, what he's saying here is that the righteousness of the Pharisees is these things we're talking about, and that's not what I want. Okay? So let's talk about this. Does this comment, when he says in chapter 6, verse 16, when you fast, Does that require fasting? Is he telling them to fast? Is he saying you must fast and therefore do it like this? He's really not saying that, is he? He's saying when you fast. He's assuming kind of, I read something, one of the commentaries I read said it's hypothetical, futuristic, or something like that. There's a technical term for it, but what he's saying is he's assuming that they're going to, but here's how he wants them to do it. You might not realize this. It might surprise you to know that at this particular time, while during Jesus' worship, during his ministry on earth, he and his followers were known for not fasting. Look in Matthew, the 9th chapter, starting in verse 14. And it said, John's disciples came and asked him, how is it that we and the Pharisees, John's disciples and the Pharisees, fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. Okay? He's relating fasting. He's explaining why his followers are not fasting at that time. He's saying they will probably later, but that's not what they were doing at that particular time. And he's saying fasting is a kind of mourning. He's not saying here that he requires you to fast, but he's saying if you do, when you do, here's how I want you to do it. Don't do it to be seen of people. And he said that for all of these religious acts of religiousness, these religious acts of piety, maybe, however you want to describe them, is this principle limited to giving, manner of dress, prayer, and fasting? Is this principle limited to those four things? I'm asking it in a way that sort of implies the answer, I hope, which is I don't think so. I think it's a principle that he's teaching here. Don't do religious acts in order to be seen by people. Don, I didn't see your hand, sorry.
I motion to Jared. I was just looking at Isaiah 58, where it says, he's talking basically about the same thing. And he says, is not the kind of fasting I have chosen, is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with hungry and to provide the poor or wanderer with shelter? So basically, he's already talked about the other stuff ahead of that, where he's talking about the people were going around in sackcloth and ashes and that sort of thing. He says, that's not what I want. This is what I want. I want you to do to others. Give your food to the hungry. If you see, it goes on down here, if you see somebody naked, clothe them. That kind of stuff. That's what he's looking for.
Right. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through this, and kind of what I have in mind for the last session we have together, which will probably be in a couple of weeks, is to talk about just overall, based on the principles that we're talking about in these passages, what does God want from us? What is the picture? What's the total picture here that God wants from us? And certainly that's a true statement. That's what he said in Isaiah, and he wants the weakest among them taken care of. And that's a theme that goes throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets and the minor prophets, when he's talking about why I'm kicking you out of here, why I'm not happy with you in the promised land, the land I promised you and the land I gave you, why I'm not happy with you. I mean, if you look at Jeremiah 7, the 7th chapter of Jeremiah, around verse 7, he says, you think that I'm happy with you because you built the temple here, and you say the temple of God, the temple of God, the temple of God, but you haven't done some other things that I really want you to do. You haven't taken care of the foreigners among you, the widows, the orphans. You haven't taken care of the weakest people among you. And because of that, if you would just do those things, I'd let you stay in the land. But now, he also, under the law, there were times where fasting was required. Isn't that correct? But he's not saying that here. Now, he's also not saying that with regard to prayer and giving and other things in this passage. There are other places where he talks about prayer. I think I wrote some of them down. He says, what about the passage where he says pray all the time? But he's not saying that particular thing here. He's saying when you do these acts of piety, this is how I want you to do them. Okay? Now, let's talk about this. He's saying, don't do these things in order to be seen of men. So is he saying, don't do these things in public, period? Is he saying, don't do acts of piety, if we want to call them that, or however you want to describe them? Is he saying, don't do these things publicly at all? Is he saying, don't pray in public? That might be a problem for some of us. A lot of us pray in public all the time, or a lot. What is he saying? I'm sorry? Be humble, okay. He said, be humble. What else is he saying? What is he saying about these acts of piety? Is it wrong, for example, to pray over your food at a restaurant? Is he saying that? Could it be wrong to pray over your food at a restaurant? Okay, I see some nods. Anybody wants to comment, make sure you get your hand up so I see you and we'll get the microphone to you. And please try to do that so that the people that are watching on the live stream can hear what you're saying. I know it's kind of cumbersome for us here and we can hear each other, but to make it effective for the people that are watching on live stream, please try to get the microphone. I saw some nods that it can be wrong to pray over your food in a restaurant. When would it be wrong to pray over your food in a restaurant, or why would it be wrong? What would make it wrong? For those of you that were nodding. Can you comment, Don?
If you're doing it just to be seen by other people around you, if you're doing it for the public to, recognize that from you, basically just out of pride, I guess, or something,
Okay.
whatever else causes you to do it, rather than actually going to the Father to thank Him for your food. Ask for blessings on it. If you're doing it for any other reason than that, it's wrong.
Okay. Any other comments? And feel free to disagree with me, by the way. As I was going through this, I have some passages from, or passages, not the right word, but some portions, some text from a commentary. There's a comment over here, Jared, when you have a chance. Okay. One of the things we're going to talk about in a little bit, the commentator said something to the effect of, what he said was, this passage is ambiguous, which means the guy writing the commentary didn't understand what it meant. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going to you because I don't understand it, and I want to know what it says, and you're telling me you don't understand it either. Why am I buying your commentary? Go ahead, sir.
Well, how can we be salt and light without doing some public religious acts? I think the humility is the point.
Okay, humility is a good point. But again, he specifically says, if you're doing it in order to be seen, I guess this is kind of the contrast to humility. You're doing it you're not praying in order to pray. In other words, the conversation you're having with God is not the important thing. You're doing it in order for others to see you and to know that you're praying.
Well, how can we publicly confess Christ if we don't?
That's a good question. How can we publicly confess Christ? Would you consider that to be the same kind of acts that we're talking about here? And that's a thought that just occurred to me, so I haven't really thought that through completely. I'm not sure. That's,
well,
on the one hand, it's something we're told to do.
In some ways, we need to publicly show that we're religious and believe in Jesus, or if we're going to hide it, we might as well be a monk and hide away and not not let anyone know you're a Christian.
Okay? But what does it mean to be religious? What does Jesus mean when he's talking about being my people or being religious? Jared over here.
Sometimes we overlook the importance of motive in Jesus' teaching and in the New Testament. And in a classic example is in 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. And throughout the New Testament, that underlying theme of motive is terribly important. So if we're praying in a restaurant just to make others think we're special, perhaps that's probably not it. But if we are praying because we're thankful to God, if we want to set a good example by doing it, then it seems to me that it's a good thing to do. Motive drives, and motive seems to be a basis for judgment.
Okay? Let's go on. And I asked this question, we've kind of discussed this already. What is God's view of religious acts? And we're going to talk about some of these things. Let's start off with the fact that he commands them to some extent. And for example, I put Leviticus up here because Leviticus is just full of specific religious acts that the Jews were required to perform on a regular basis. Sacrifices, festivals, all of those sorts of things are in, not necessarily just in Leviticus, but in the under the law, they had a lot of things they were required to do. 1 Thessalonians 5, pray without ceasing. Luke 22, the Lord's Supper. There are things that are public that we're commanded to do, we're required, we're told to do. And I don't mean this list to be exhaustive, this is just some examples. But on the other hand, if you look at passages like Hosea, the 6th chapter in the Minor Prophets, it says, for I desire mercy, not sacrifice, acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. If you want to go to Amos, the 5th chapter, starting in verse 21, I despise your religious festivals, your assemblies are a stench to me. That doesn't sound good, does it? Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. And I think in this particular case, he was saying, you do all of these religiosity type things. You're doing these festivals, you're doing songs, you're doing assemblies, you're giving burnt offerings, grain offerings, et cetera, but it's a stench, he says to me. And why? He says, let justice roll. So apparently they were ignoring justice. And I think we talked toward the beginning of all of this that justice, the concept of justice under the law and under God's law, he's talking not necessarily about seeing to it that the guilty are punished. That's maybe part of it, but he's talking about everybody getting a fair shake, including the weakest among them. And he said, let righteousness roll on like a never-ending stream. Let's look at Micah, the 6th chapter. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require for you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. There's the humility you mentioned specifically. And I think these passages show that he's awfully concerned about the, the motivation, as Bob said, of what's going on here and why things are being done. So the New Testament's not left out, look at Acts 16. This is when Paul is in Athens, and he said, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." Going on down, God did this so that you would seek him and perhaps reach out for him to find him. Though he is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Now, he's talking to a group of pagans here, and he's trying to persuade them that the God, the unseen God that he worships, is the God that they should also worship, and that their idols are not worth their effort. So he's contrasting God with these idols. But the thing that he says here that I think is significant for our present discussion is he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. He doesn't need our religiosity. But that's part of the relationship we have with God. What he's saying, I think, in this passage in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount is that these things, when you pray, it's between me and you. Don't involve other people in it. Now, we pray as a group many times. It's between us and God. Okay? If you're fasting, don't fast in order to be seen of people. Fast in order to grow closer to God. If you're giving, give because those to whom you're giving need it, and you can afford it, and you want to support them, not because you want to show someone else how important or how significant you are. Look at James, the first chapter. He says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." Is that me that's making those noises? Okay. If that becomes too annoying, let me know, and I'll try to see if I can fix it. James says this is what true religion is. All right? I think too often we think religion is what we do on Sunday mornings. And I don't disagree that that's part of it, but I think there's much more that God is looking for from his people than simply coming together, doing these religious acts as a group or individually on Sunday morning. It's being his people 24 hours a day. Remember the number I put up on the board? Can you remember the number I put up on the board or on the screen the first session? How many hours are there in a week? 168. The engineer came up with that quickly. I think that God expects us to be his people 168 hours a week, not just 4 or so that we might spend together, an hour Sunday morning, an hour for class, hour for worship, maybe an hour Sunday evening, maybe an hour Wednesday night, that traditionally before the pandemic. He expects us to be his people all that time. And to me, that means there is a Christian way, or there is a way a Christian would do whatever we do all week long. There's a way a Christian would maintain his house. There's a way a Christian would drive to work. There's a way a Christian would behave at work. Those are some of the things I want to talk about as we get to the end of this. What are some of those things? What do these principles that Jesus is announcing in the Sermon on the Mount mean to that? So let's get back to what does Jesus mean here. I don't believe he means don't do things in public. We do things in public. We sometimes have to do things in public. There are some things that we're told to do that are public things. But if you're doing it in public, you really need to consider why you're doing it. The motivation, as Bob was saying, are you doing it with humility? First of all, are you doing it in order to be seen? I think if you're doing it in order to be seen, maybe you're trying to make a point of some sort, but if you're doing it in order to be seen, that may not necessarily be a bad thing, but I think you need to, at that point, consider very carefully what Jesus is saying here. Am I doing it in a way that the Pharisees would have said, looked at and said, yeah, that's okay, that's what we should be doing? The other thing that occurred to me is, are you judging others based on whether they do it too? Okay? Are you trying to, if you, and I don't know what a good example would be, but if you do this thing publicly, do you judge others because they don't do it the same way that you're doing it? I think, again, if that's the case, that maybe you ought to look carefully, and I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say what conclusion you should arrive at based on this consideration, but I think maybe that should be a flag, I'm not going to say red flag, but a flag that goes up that says, hey, maybe I ought to think about this a little bit. If I'm using this in order to be seen, or if I'm using this as a criterion to judge other people, judge my brothers and sisters, maybe I ought to think about that, whether that's exactly what Jesus wants for me. Any other comments on these acts of the commentator that I was so impressed with that I mentioned earlier, talks about acts of greater righteousness, acts that Jesus is saying, these things, this is what I mean when I say I want you to have greater righteousness than the Pharisees. Do you have any other comments about that? I think the bottom line that Jesus is making here is, I want these things to be between me and you. And I think if you go through the New Testament, the relationship we have with God is very important to our status, to our Christianity, to our being His people. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think sometimes we maybe over-analyze, what the motivation was behind people's behaviors. And I think as far as like judging others, I don't think it's really possible to know. And so the important thing a lot of times, I think, is that the good act was done. And then, I've kind of observed that a lot of times you find out people's true motivations, like at funerals, when it becomes apparent that they lived a lifestyle that they did these acts repeatedly, and you only saw one of them, but, it was a habit. Or so I'm probably rambling a little, but to me, I think we just sometimes maybe overthink a little bit whether or not it was good to do it in front of somebody or not. But I think sometimes the more important thing is that the good act still needs to be done. If somebody needs helped, they still need to be helped, whether or not it's in front of somebody or not.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of these types of acts that we've been talking about. And I mentioned this, again, way back at the beginning. One of the things that is apparent to me in looking at Scripture is you need to be very careful to see who was being addressed when you're talking about these things and how it was being said. And the example I used at that point was in leadership, us followers. I'm not going to use the word for. There's a slang word that I heard for people who sit in the pews. Somebody called them pukes. Sorry about that. But us people who sit in the pews, those people who sit in the pews, the instruction to them, and I believe it's in Hebrews, is to obey your leaders. But the instruction to leaders is don't lord it over the people who are following you. Lead by example. Be a servant to those people. So I think we have to look carefully at who is being addressed. I call it the direction of instruction. That makes a big difference. And I think we also, and what I'm talking about here, and what Jesus is talking about here, is not giving somebody a rule to say, again, I've said this before in this study, we're awfully good at trying to find rules because we want rules. We want black and white. And Jesus is not always going to cooperate with us in that. He wants us to be people of principle and deep integrity so that when something comes up that doesn't necessarily fit the exact rule, that our principle and integrity will lead us in the right direction. But Jesus here is not trying to give us a rule to beat somebody over the head with, to say, you can't do that in public. That was just wrong because you were doing that so somebody would see you doing it. Again, that's making a judgment about why somebody's doing something. And that's not, Jesus is saying, when you do these things, here's how you should do it. And he's talking to us on a very one-on-one basis about how we should be doing these things. And all I'm saying here, and I want to make this clear, I'm not saying don't do these things and don't do them in public. I'm just saying, think about it. Think about why you're doing it and whether or not you're doing it the way Jesus wants you to do it, whether you're following the principles he wants you to follow. And I want to move on here. There are a couple of other things I want to cover before we're done, and we're going to run out of time. The rest of chapter 6, he talks about, there are a couple of passages. The first one is, where is your treasure? Okay, he says, just to summarize this passage, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Okay, don't store up treasure on earth, but store up treasure in heaven. And again, we're still talking here about having righteousness that's greater than that of the Pharisees. We're still talking about that principle of greater righteousness. So what is he saying here when he says, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven and not treasure on earth? Based on what he's just talked about, what would be storing up treasure on earth? What would store up treasure on earth? Doing these things in order to be seen, trying to be, beat the band and show how a great person you are here on earth. And I think Jesus would say, okay, you've shown that. That's a treasure on earth. And I'm not trying to be exclusive. I think there are other ways we can store treasure on earth. And when we get to the bottom here, he's going to talk about our individual wealth and say you cannot serve both God and money. Now, money's the root of all evil, right? Yeah, that was intentional, and I heard the comment. That's not what he said. He said the love of money. But again, I think sometimes when we look at that passage, we try to squirrel in all the exceptions we can and say, well, what I'm doing is not, it's just, being prudent. And Jesus is saying here, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and wealth, because whoever you serve, you're going to have requirements of that service. Jesus is not saying here, don't be prudent with your money, but he is saying, don't be a slave to it. If you're going to be a slave to God. You can't serve two masters. The other thing he says here, if you get to verse 25, he says, don't worry. This is pretty hard for me. I don't know, I've said several times, I think, as we go through this, I know I've said it several times in different contexts, but I think every one of us is tempted by by different things. There are different things that cause each of us to struggle. There are different things each of us struggle with. Some things are not a struggle to me. Gambling is not a struggle for me. It doesn't entice me. Other people, it might. But worry, that's a problem for me. I have a hard time sleeping at night if I know there's something I have to do in the morning, or if there's something I need to take care of that hasn't been taken care of yet. I have a hard time with this kind of passage. But he says, can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Now, we might argue with him on this one a little bit. Well, yeah, I can, by my own effort, I'm maybe not by worrying about it. The stress of worry is probably going to shorten my life. But if I take something seriously enough to do something about it, if I take it seriously enough to quit smoking, or if I take it, another thing I'm not tempted by, or if I take it seriously enough to cut down on sweets or to stay fit or whatever, maybe I can extend my life. But the worry itself is not going to extend my life. And this other thing that I highlighted in the second paragraph there, just like at the end of chapter 5, when he said, he's telling them to love their enemies, and he's saying, don't even the pagans love their brothers and sisters. So if that's all you're doing, how are you any better than they are? And here he's saying the pagans run after all of these things. And when he's talking about all of these things here, he's talking about food, clothing, and wealth. And you can see that if you look through the passage. He's saying, don't worry about your life, what you eat, drink, or about your body, what you wear. And he talks about wealth. He's talked about wealth before, but he's talking about those three things: food, clothing, and wealth. That's kind of our physical needs. And he says, the pagans run after all of these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. And here's the part that bothers me, but he says, have faith. God will take care of you. Does that mean, and I guess I struggle to explain adequately, and here I am, I'm the teacher, and I just criticized the commentator for saying there was a passage you didn't fully understand, and I'm getting ready to tell you, I'm not sure I fully understand this. Is he saying here, what is he saying here when he says God will take care of this? And we can maybe let me see, make sure I get to the right slide. Go forward into chapter 7, where he says, in verse 7, there's the first bell, where he says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, the one who knocks, the door will be open. Is he telling us he's going to give us everything that we need? And I think the answer to that is he pretty clearly is saying that. I'll give you what you need. I think the other side of the coin is what you need may not always be what you want. Okay? And I like in Matthew, in the 7th chapter, in verse 9, this is one of my favorite passages. And for years, it just was one of those things I read and kind of skipped past, and then I started thinking about it a little bit. But he says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. And this kind of echoes what he said right before the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the two most important aspects of the law are love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But that passage is meaningful to me because he's saying You know, we who are evil, we are sinners, we're mortal sinners, and yet we're not going to give, if your son, if your child asks you for, and maybe the examples here are not that meaningful to us, but let's say one of your children, your 5 or 6 year old child comes up and says, I want a Sony, what's the most expensive and newest and latest and greatest gaming system today? I have no idea. I'm not tempted by that either. Whatever it is, that's what they ask for. $500 gaming system says, that's what I want for my birthday. Okay. Number one, you may not have the money to give them that. Number two, you may not think that's a good idea. Number three, you may not want to give them that. But if you don't give them the new gaming system that they really want and they really ask for, you're on the other hand, you're not going to give them a pack of razor blades, are you? You're not going to give them, he said, you're not going to give them a rock instead of food. You're not going to give them a snake instead of a fish. Child asks for a pet. You're not going to give him a piranha. Maybe you would. You're not going to give him something that's going to hurt him. But we who are evil, if we know how to give good gifts, how much more do you think God in heaven, the Lord of the universe, the person who made us, the person who tells us he wants a relationship with us, he's going to give us good gifts. It may not be what we want. It may not be what we specifically asked for, but it's not going to be a snake. It's not going to be a rock. I want to read James, the 4th chapter. This is another one of my favorite passages. But he said, you desire to have, so you kill. This is in verse 2 of James 4. You covet and cannot get what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. I think, Jesus says, ask and you'll find, or ask and you'll receive, knock and doors will be opened, seek and you'll find. I don't think Jesus is saying here that he's going to give us exactly what we always ask for. And I think James maybe makes that a little bit more clear, that it's important what we're asking for, why we're asking for, what our motivation in asking is, and what kinds of things we really need. And the closer we can make our requests, the more we learn, the more we study God's Word, the closer relationship we develop with God, the more we're going to know His will, and the more we're going to conform our requests and our needs to His will. And that's when the requests and the receipts are going to start becoming closer together. He wants us to ask out of faith. A lot of this that Jesus is talking here is a matter of faith. We'll talk about that more next week. That was the second bell. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your attention. We have a couple of more sessions for this quarter, and I hope we'll do some things that are meaningful to all of us. Thank you very much.